Okay, so now let's go over Chapter 6 itself, right, as an overview. Remember, these are going to be, this is going to be a much shorter version than the full-blown, right, ones I provide you that the author created, right? I just try to hit the high points, right, as much as I can. So the chapter is Chapter 6. It's titled More CSS Basics. And we have a few things to discuss here. Something called the box model. We have, which contains the height, the width, the margin, the border, the padding. Right? All these things are really what we consider for every element that we use on our page. We also have how to center the web page itself on the page. Not center each element, but center the page as a whole. Right? Applying shadows, rounded corners, right? Some more background images, and then different ways that we can apply alpha, transparency, or opacity, however you like to pronounce it, to our content or elements. Okay. All right, so the first thing we want to look at is the width and height. Right? So far we have not determined or decided how high something should be or how wide something should be. Okay? Well, now we can. Right? So far, all of our content goes where? All the way across, right, the screen. So depending on your browser size, that's the width of the content. It's going to be all the way to each end of the browser. Well, now we can actually decide that maybe we don't want it to go all the way, right, to the edge of the browser. We do that with the width property. We decide how big. We can use percentage, we can use pixels, right? So it's really up to us how we want to go about doing that, right? What the unit of measurement is going to be. Now, we also have some other ones like min width or max width. So don't go any smaller than, don't go any bigger than. Right? Essentially, that's what that says. And then we have our height property. So how tall do we want our element, right, to be? And so we can use height. And again, we can use percentage. We can use pixels. Okay? And so these are some of our height and width properties. Now, I mentioned this before in the past. In one of our sessions, we talked about the box model. I believe we are adding something like margin to one of our, hands-on. And I wanted to just tell you what that was a part of before we actually discussed it. And now we're actually here. So every element has something called a box model. Okay? So it's just kind of this, not necessarily invisible box, but it's there. It's a series of elements that essentially govern that element. Okay? And every element has a box model. Okay? Now, the box model itself contains this graphic. So let's for a moment use an example of the paragraph. Right? The paragraph element has an opening p tag and a closing p tag. So let's consider the content within the p tags inside this box. Okay? Called content. So we have a p tag, and then we have stuff inside that p tag. And we are now going to start to adjust the way this p tag looks, right? This element, this box. Everything on our web page is a box. That's right. It could be a rectangle. It could be square. There are no circles, okay, in elements. Elements don't have circles. They're either basically square or a rectangle based on the properties you provide. So you can go taller, you can go wider, right? Now, a graphic that looks like a circle is really not a circle. It's either a rectangle or a square based on, right, the size. The graphic may look like a circle, but there's actually, right, a container containing that circle, which is actually square, right, or rectangular in shape. Okay? So that's why we call it a box model. And here it is. We have our content within our paragraph. Typically, our elements can have a border. We see it as like what, a black line, which doesn't always have to be a black line. Well, what separates the content from that border is what's called padding. So the space between the edge of the box, right, and the content is called padding. Okay? If you decide to add background color to your element, the background color will show within the content area as well as the padding. So background color shows up in content and in the padding area. Okay? It's simply space is what it is, right? You're giving space between the border and the content. Now, after the padding, you have something called a border. This border can be solid, it could be dashed, it could be beveled, it could be inset, outset. We have lots of different things. It could be different colors, different sizes, okay? And so, after the padding, you have a border. You can turn it on, you can turn it off. It's up to you, but it is always there unless you turn it off or on, right? It's there theoretically, right? We have a border, whether you're using it or not, that's the question, okay? But it's available to you if you want to use it. Now, what separates one element from another element is something called margin. You can't see it. It has no color. It's simply space. It's simply space. Okay. So remember when you had the anchor next to the anchor and there was space between it? Well, some of the space was the space you coded in. The other space is the space you use a space bar, but the space after that is the margin between each of the elements, right? So there's a margin, right, on the anchor, a margin on the other one. So, right, now not all elements have the box model applied, right? Most elements don't have a border applied to it, right? Some elements don't have any margin associated with it, right? So it's just a matter of understanding the elements and what's applied by default. Okay. Now, there are some developers and designers that say, you know what, I don't want to have to do any guesswork about which ones have what and which ones don't have what. So I'm going to set a rule that says blank everything out. I'm starting with a blank canvas. I decide what has a border, what has padding, and what has a margin. That's very, very common. This will typically appear at the top of the CSS page, right? Where it just simply says, here's all these elements. Or it uses a shortcut to say every element, border 0, margin 0, right? Padding 0. And it essentially zeroes everything out. Now you start with a clean slate, and now you decide what elements have, right? You apply them using your CSS. So, here they are textually, right? We kind of talked about each one of these. Content is essentially the text, right? The content within the element, right? It may not necessarily be text, right? It's simply the content. Padding, area between the content and the border. Border, right? It's between the padding and the margin. And then the margin essentially is the distance or the space between each element. Okay. So if you want to get one element away from the other, you use margin. And you separate them by using margin, not padding. Padding is inside the box. Margin is outside the box. Okay. All right. So we have some of those properties. We had 3: margin, padding, and border. And the question is, how do I apply margin in this case? There are a whole bunch of ways. Okay. What I want you to get from this slide is pick one and then kind of go for it. Right. My recommendation for you is to use the last one. It's just that much easier. And so we're going to explain each one of these. So the first way we can write a margin rule is to say margin 0, which says every single side of that box gets no margin. So one value says do it to everything. Okay? So by using only one value here, it says go ahead and kill the margin at the top, the right, the bottom, and the left of that box. Right? That element. Okay. The second way we can write, okay, is we have now 2 values. We had one before, which meant everything. We have now 2 values. What do you think this stands for? 2 values. Which sides of the box model will be affected by 2 values? Thank you. So, the first value is for the top and the bottom of the box. The second value is for the right and the left of the box. Now, what we want to remember, because it's just kind of gets easier that way, because as we move further down, it will help. The box model is always written going clockwise. So that's why the first one is always the top. Right? If you have two, it's always going to be the top one, starting with the top. So this first one's going to be top and bottom. The second one's going to be right and left. So we always talk about it in a clockwise manner. Now, the third option. 4 sides, but we got 3 values. What are we looking at here? What do you think the first one's going to apply to? Well, I'm sorry, I heard 2 things. No, just the top, right? So the first one's going to be top only. The second one is going to be, bingo, right and left. And the last one is going to be the bottom. So if you're going to use 3, this is what happens. Top, right and left, bottom. Okay? That's how that is styled. Now, for me, the easiest is the last one. What's the first one? Second one? Third one? And the last one? Left. Clockwise, very simple, right? Makes it easier for us. Now, once you get accustomed to this, feel free, right, to use these other shortcuts. But, again, my opinion is to simply choose this last one. It's easier in our brains that we got 4 sides, we got 4 values, done. Right? Now, just as a question, why does the 0 not have like pixels or any unit of measurement next to it? Thank you. Right? Yeah. Whether it's 0% or 0 pixels or 0 EMs or 0 points or $0, it's 0. Right? There is no unit of measurement for 0. It's just nothing, right? We don't have it. Good. All right. So in the future, if you do not put any unit of measurement in a 0 value. Great. Can we move on? Yes. Because the powers that be at the W3C said we don't need them. It just depends, yeah. Because possibly, see, the fonts have multi-words, and even though you're using quotes to connect, right, to group those multi-word fonts, perhaps that was just an easier way to go about it. Yeah. So. That's true. That's correct. That's probably a better description of why they may have chosen commas to separate them. I mean, although font family is one, right? Font family, it's one value you're choosing, right? You have to look at multiple fonts, I guess. Yeah. So who knows? Yeah. We could theorize about it if you like some more, but yeah. All right. What's really cool is that our padding looks exactly the same. So if you are comfortable with margin, then you're comfortable with padding. Right? You got one option, 2, 3, and 4. It's exactly the same. It just affects another part of the box model, right? The padding. Now, just as an FYI to throw it out there. See these right here, related properties? It's the second bullet. Padding top, padding right, padding left, padding bottom. It's the same with margin. Margin top, margin right, margin left, margin bottom. That's your alternative. For example, if you only wanted padding for the top, your option is either writing padding, right, with the our 4 options, right, our 4 little values as 20, 0, 0, and 0, or you can use this form, which is padding dash top, and then whatever value you want. In this case, let's call it 20. And now you're writing one line and one value. Again, to me, it's the same, right? It's one value. So you have one line. It's not like you have to write multiple lines. But again, whatever you feel most comfortable with, if you find padding dash top, padding dash right, padding dash left, padding dash bottom, great. But I would not recommend using all 4 of these in lieu of the last option in the sample. So if you're going to have 4 paddings, right, use this. Okay? Use the shortcut, not the long way. Good. Less work on the browser for you to have this shortcut than to have it long ways. Okay? Which means it translates into a faster loading page. Okay? Right. That is the processing. Right? The processing is much faster, then hence, the page can load faster. Okay, let's continue on. Now, the border is a little bit different. Okay. Now, though the border does have its own individual, right, different properties like the border width, the border style, and the border color, you can combine all of these like we did with margin and padding and have a one-liner that simply provides you with the width, right, style, and color of the border, all in one line, which is really nice. Okay. So those are like 3 parts of our box model, right? We have the padding, border, and margin. And then, of course, we play with the width and the height of that box. Okay. Although the width and height is not part of the box model, right? It's part of how we size that box. Okay, let's continue on. Rounded corners, yay, right? We no longer have to use graphics. We like that. And it's actually kind of cool because what we do is we'll have to have 2 lines for this. One to apply a border and then one to apply the radius, right? The actual rounding of the corners. Okay? And so we use border dash radius to get this corners from 90 degrees to a 15 pixel radius. Right? And again, you can play with that all you want. Put a small number, put a large number, put a negative number, and see what happens. Right? Can we move on? Okay. All right. Centering the content, right? Centering your page in the browser. Okay. I want to center all of this, the whole page, in the center of the browser. Notice that there's even amount of space on the left and an even amount of space on the right of this graphic. We've centered the whole entire page, but not the individual elements. That's not what we're trying to do. And so we do that by using, right, margin and width. They go together. You can't have margin on its own. You have to have it width if you want to center it. So we use margin and we set it to auto to automatically figure out what the margin should be if my width is smaller than 100, right? You can't have your page is actually centered because your page is at 100%, so there it is. As soon as the page gets smaller in width, right, 80% let's say, you now have room to move that, right, page left or right within the browser. Margin simply says, I'll figure it out. I'll give you even amount on the left, even amount on the right. Just tell me how wide, right, you want the page to be. Not the browser. How wide do you want the page to be? Oh, okay. I wanted 80% of the browser width. So if the browser width, right, is the whole entire screen, well, now it's going to be 80%. If it's resized, well, then you're going to get 80%. You're always going to get 80%, right? Until the browser can't get smaller anymore, and right, so, yeah. All right. At some point, the browser's too small, and right, it won't allow. So very, just a couple lines of code, and your page now centers a more modern approach. All right, let's talk about opacity, right? The transparency, alpha, essentially what we're doing here. 3 words that essentially mean the same. So the opacity or opacity property, here it is, okay? We can use to make a color transparent. So 0 is completely transparent, while 1, the value 1, is completely opaque, which means you can't see through it. So here we have a .0, which is closer to 1 than it is closer to 0, right? So it goes 0.0 to 1. So 1.0 or 0.0. Anything in between, right, that is your transparency. Think of it as percentages, right? 1% transparent, 2%, 3%, 4%, that kind of thing. Okay? And so all we have here is a sample is we have an H1, which has a background color of white, okay? And then an opacity is set so we can kind of see through that H1 into the trees in the background. Okay. Notice 2 lines of code to accomplish this task. Okay. Your next option is to use 1 line of code to accomplish the same task. Okay. These are some of these CSS3 coloring options we have. So we can use RGBA. A stands for alpha, which is transparent. Here it is, right? Which will essentially do the same thing. RGBA, we have all 3 RGB colors, R, right, red, green, and blue, and then our alpha, which is the same concept, right, 0 and 1. So why does this example have the color property if this property is doing it for us? Cha-ching. You got it. So what we're doing is setting ourselves up for success. And we say, well, I'm not sure if the browser is going to be compatible, right? Is going to be able to do this for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that it's white at least if it doesn't know how to do this. At least I get that, right? So you always want to put in the minimum, right? And then add in some of the cool features, okay? Yeah. And the third option of color, one is hexadecimal, one is RGBA, and the third, we don't have it in there, a slide for it, it's in all the slides, is the HSL and A, right? Hue, saturation, lightness, and then the alpha. Same concept, one-liner to accomplish both the color and the transparency. And now the last thing is the gradients. Again, this used to be done with a graphic, okay? And now we can do it with code, right, with CSS. We have 2 options. We have linear gradients and we have radial gradients. Now, just in case you're not sure what gradients is, it's basically one color that turns into another color, whether it's from the left to the right, from the top to the bottom, the right to the left, the bottom to the top. That's linear. Or radial, where it's like the sun, right? You get this dot in the center, and then the color, right, just goes out from there. So the center is going to be one color, the outer is going to be another color. So it gradients, it right? It stretches from one to the other and mixes in. So we call that a gradient. So it flows from one color to another. And so this is how we write it. So if I wanted to write a property, right, a declaration for the gradient, the second line, right, is the line I want to focus on. Background dash image, linear dash gradient, and then how I want it, right, to the bottom. So I want it to start white, and then to the bottom go that color, right, to bottom. Now, again, why do we have background color in that rule? What? Exactly. So if the other one doesn't work, at least give me a solid color. I'll take that. Even though it's not gradient, I'll take solid. And that's what this is right here, just in case the browser doesn't get it. And then again, we have radial as well. So now instead of linear gradient, we have radial gradient. And then these are the 2 colors. And yeah. I do not believe you are. I think you can have more colors. I'm not 100% on that, but I can look into that. But it's definitely a start, at least. Yep. Great question. All right, and I think that's it for really the chapter. All right. Any questions? Yeah, Ron. Yep. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think right now we're looking simply from top, bottom, left, right, top. Yeah. Yeah. I don't believe that there's a diagonal from top corner to bottom corner. I don't believe there is, but I can look into that as well. I don't recall that being an option. Any other questions? All right. Fantastic. All right, so we just covered the chapter itself.